Hello. So I'm Kimmy on William Street, and Missy and I have been doing a lot of talking and trying to think about what are some of the harder parts of the quilting process that maybe we can help with. And one of those that I know a lot of people have questions with and not really sure how to proceed on is figuring out the actual quilting of the quilt. You have this top, it's completely done, you pick the colors and the pattern and put it all together. How do you finish it? So we thought it would be kind of fun to make a series of videos that kind of go over the quilting design process, how I come up with what I put on the quilt, and to share that to maybe hopefully give you some inspiration and ideas and tips on how to make that process easier for you. So today we're going to start with one of our recent quilts that we just finished, and this one is called Swish. It's one of our patterns that we're done with, and we're just going to kind of go through. I'm just going to walk you through how I came up with what I was doing. First, a couple of things that I always try to have is a printout of the quilt. So whether it is a drawing, if we design the quilt ourselves, it's very easy for us to print out a drawing. We use EQ, so it's simple to have that option, or if you use Illustrator or however you use it, some form of a just 2D drawing. I prefer this way because it's flat. I see the whole quilt, and it's easy for me to draw on and get the right proportions of everything. So if you have this as an option, it's fantastic. However, if you don't, I will take a photo of the quilt. I do try to have someone hold it and take a photo straight on with my phone so that it is as flat as possible, and then print that out, and so that I can draw directly on that printout of the quilt so that I can look at the whole thing and start to put the aspects together. So that is one thing that I always start with when I'm trying to decide how to quilt a quilt. Also, another thing that I will use periodically, this really for smaller sections or to test scale, is I will use a plexiglass sheet. And this is nice because I can actually put it directly on top of the quilt, whether it's on a table, on my machine, wherever it's at, and I can draw on it with a marker, and then it eventually just wipes right off. So this is a great tool to have as well throughout the process, and it's something that allows me to really test scale. So if I'm not sure, what size I want things to end up, this isn't going to be able to allow me to decide that, but if I go full size to the quilt, I can play with scale and determine how big I want those elements to be. So to start out with, the first thing that I always do when I'm trying to decide how to quilt is I'm going to try to break it down into smaller sections. If I'm looking at the whole quilt, it can be very overwhelming, and it seems like there's a lot to go over and a lot to do. But if I look at it and say, okay, well, how can I break this down? How can I find smaller sections to work with? Then it's not going to be as intimidating. So with this quilt, I went ahead and I looked, and you can see that we have our natural lines here of the different triangles, diamonds, whatever you want to call them. So I looked at that and I thought, well, what if I just extend some of those lines? If I take this and I throw a line in here, that's going to extend that shape. It's going to now be echoing that middle completed diamond. And I've now broken down that negative space into more manageable work areas. So that was the very first thing I did when I was looking at this quilt, was I decided I'm going to break these shapes down. When I'm doing this on the paper, I'm not worried about perfection. So I'm not necessarily going to get out a ruler unless it's like a small area I'm really trying to work out. I'm just going to go ahead and freehand most of it because it's just a guide and a sketch. So it's okay if that's not completed, if it's not perfect. Then as I look at this, I see, okay, well, I have these blank areas here. Do I want to do something different with them, or do I want to fill them in? In this instance, I use a lot of ghosting. I like ghosting, taking the elements that are there and putting them into the negative space. And that's a great way to use up that negative space and to actually add a lot of repetition and some design sense to move your eye through that. So I said, well, let's go ahead and just continue that out. And I went ahead and ghosted in these same diamonds. So you're going to get the same element in this little bit of negative space on the end. So now, as you can see, I've got this whole section broken down. Obviously, I could go through and do that on the whole quilt. If I'm working on a lot of different elements, sometimes I will go ahead and design out the whole quilt. Other times, I just put in enough to know what I'm doing. I don't need to spend a whole ton of time on this. Obviously, it's just my guide. So as long as I have enough information here to know what I'm doing, that's all I need to worry about. So I'm also going to fill in these triangles here so that it mimics. You can see I've got this one here, and then I do have one more before I get to the center triangle. So I'm going to put that in as well. And so with this quilt, what I decided to do is just continue all those elements. Go ahead and ghost them in, make it so that they appeared to be there even though they were not. I also added one more little bump in here to to finish out ghosting this shape. So now this is all filled in. Now that I've got it broken down, it's a lot easier to look at it and say, okay, well, what do I want to do? How am I going to fill it in? Again, I like to create negative space areas. And so on this one, I decided as opposed to quilting directly on these lines, they would get lost pretty easily. I went ahead and echoed them instead. And I'm going to echo all the way along the inside of these shapes. Obviously not that far in, that's not an echo. Just about 1/4 of an inch is a pretty good echo, because I also then went ahead and echoed on the outside of the shape. So you can see now that that line that continues the line of the green angles, that line is actually not going to be quilted at all. That's going to disappear. And what you're left with is these little 1/2 inch, roughly 1/2 inch thin empty spots. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow those sections to just stand out a little bit more. You're going to see them. If it was just lines, those designs are going to butt up next to each other and they're going to kind of get lost. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and echo those on every single one of my diamonds. Again, I'm not going to draw all these in for you. You'll get the general idea. So this is what I've got here. And now you can see I have, I'm going to do that one more time here so you can see all the different sections. So I've got these sections now that I've completely broken down. And I had to think, okay, how do I want to address these different sections? On this one, I will also take time into play. So don't feel bad if you say, okay, well, I've got to get this quilt finished quickly. How can I do that? Sometimes time is an element that we need to address. So with this one, I knew that I needed to finish it quickly. We had a deadline. We wanted to have it done by a certain weekend for an event that we were a part of. So I knew that whatever I needed to do, it needed to be something I could just freehand. If I'm using a lot of rulers and a lot of marking, then I know that it's going to take a long time very quickly. And this, I had 2 days, and with a toddler, 2 days, I don't get a lot of time each day. So I went ahead, I'm like, well, I know that with the white, I want that to be the background. I want that to recede. So I just put back and forth lines. Something small is just going to fill in the area. It's going to be super easy to go through and do. With this quilt, it was also nice. I didn't have to mark any lines because of the blocks. I just used the blocks for guide. So that's one thing you can look at as well. What marking do I have to do? How can I use the blocks to my advantage? So I'm going to fill that in. And I looked at that and I thought, you know what? Because this is just white, it's just the background, let's just repeat that in all of the background sections. So I went ahead and just filled in back and forth lines here. Because I knew I could do those very quickly, complete them fairly easily, and then move on to more elements. So now I've got those sections done, and I'm looking at the green. I knew that with these sections, I wanted to continue whatever I was doing in the outer green sections. I wasn't going to treat them any differently, even though they were made of the white. I was going to treat them exactly like the diamonds, to finish in filling in those diamonds. So I'm going to leave those, and I'm not going to worry about that. So then I was looking at, okay, what can I come up with a different design there? Again, something that I could easily do by hand, but kind of echoed those shapes. Because with the way that we colored this, a lot of those triangles were broken down. And I knew it'd be fun to kind of echo those shapes and to stick with that motif. So that's when I went ahead and decided to just go back and forth. Now what I did here though is I went ahead and moved along, and I did this little fill-in design all along this side first. And then after I was done with that, I was able to sneak across. I use ditches a lot. When you see the overall quilt, you're not going to see them. If you're doing something that you're putting in a show, it might be worth going ahead and tying off and moving. But if it's just something you're using for yourself, you're not going to be inspecting it and you're not going to see it. So I actually did use ditches, and I would move along this ditch, and then that allowed me to come up and finish off around this side of it. So I was able to break it down, and like I said, very little ruler work, maybe a little ruler work to move along the diagonals, but I was able to freehand and fill those in fairly easily and get that done. Again, looking at the design, a lot of repetition on this quilt, so we're going to go ahead and I just filled in these as the same way. Repetition is actually your friend in design. Don't be scared of it. It helps to connect things together and to move through the whole process. And it's one of the main elements that you want to look at. So you don't want everything to be too repetitious. You want to break it up a little bit and keep things exciting, but don't be afraid of a little repetition. So now I've got these elements here that I've just repeated throughout, and I'm going to complete that everywhere all around the quilt. Now the other thing that I wanted to do is I knew that these little center areas, I wanted to use them to add a little bit of a surprise element. And I went through a lot of different things I could do, and I didn't love any of them. So if I get to this point and I'm just not sure where to go, I will actually start quilting it at this point. I won't wait. There's no point just for me to spend 3 days stressing over what am I going to put here when I could be working on the rest of the quilt. So I'll put it on the machine, and as I work on the machine and get the quilt going, a lot of times I'll have something fill in and I'll decide, oh well, this looks great, this is how I want to do this. So I had the center section that I have figured out yet, but I went ahead and put the quilt on the machine and quilted everything else. I've got all the other elements down. That way I'm not spending a few days looking just at that center section and not getting anything done. It allows me to get a lot done and stay on task, on schedule. So then at this point, I actually went ahead and put my plexiglass directly on top of the quilt while it was on the machine. And this allowed me to see the other elements. They were done, they were quilted, and I can now play with that center section with, in comparison to how the rest of the quilt is going to look. So I started out with a couple of things and draw on, kind of go through some of my original ideas, and it was right. I didn't really like how they were fitting in. They felt incomplete and like they didn't really mesh enough. So I decided, well, what I need to do is I'm going to repeat some of these same elements. So I was going to go with, decided to add some curves in. There's a lot of straight lines in this quilt. So let's add some curves to make things a little more interesting. So I went ahead and added in the curve sections. That brings the shape in a little bit more and adds some interest. And then, like I said, I wanted to echo these 1/4 inch empty spots, negative space, to add that shape. Then at that point I have a smaller section and I went ahead and added in my petals. Echo them. And I'm left with these very interesting shapes that add a nice contrast to the quilt, but then also really kind of stand out a little bit against all of the other elements and give your eye somewhere to look at. And then as with the 4 of them around the quilt, it's a very good way to move your eye around the whole quilt. At this point, I didn't really want to add in a new element. I thought that that would be busy and distracting and it wouldn't really feel like the quilt meshed. So I went ahead and added in the same zigzag lines that I put in the rest of the background. So then at this point, I'm able to decide, okay, I really like how this looks. I can move the plexiglass off and now I can quilt it. I have a very short memory. I will leave this design on the plexiglass against my wall behind me until I've got it quilted. Actually, all 4 of them, because if I'm rolling the quilt and moving it, I want to make sure that I do the same thing on each quilt. So either on each section, so take a photo of it, leave your design somewhere. So if I don't have it on a piece of paper for me to refer to, I want to leave some reference, because if I start at the top of the quilt, by the time I get to the bottom, I've forgotten what I did in some of those elements. And that's not a good place to be in, especially if you want it to match. So make sure that you take a photo of it with your phone or leave your plan, something that you can see. So I'm not going to wipe this off until the whole quilt is done. And that's just going to be easy for me to come back and make sure that it's all completed correctly. And then you can go through with a piece of wet paper towel and we'll wipe right off before your next quilt. So hopefully we've given you some tips and ideas on how you can go ahead and figure out the designs and break things down to make it a little bit simpler. And we are going to go ahead and do a series of these, go through some of the quilts that we've done recently and some of the quilts that we have coming up, and just break down the process for you and give you some tips and ideas. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and send us an email or post them in the comments below, and we'll try to address those in future videos as we go throughout and share this with you. So thank you for stopping by, and happy quilting!